All righty. Clock says it is about that time, so we'll go ahead and get ready to get started this morning. Anybody else like me have a hard time realizing we are into the month of May now? And the 2026 is already 1/3 in the rearview mirror. So it's just flying by. Prayer list. Susan Swain. There's information in the bulletin. Anything newer than what's in there? Just said she was hospitalized for complications and will be undergoing rehab. Anything new on that? Huh? Bradford Heights? Okay. She is at Bradford Heights. Terry Brooks, it says, had a fall and is recovering from that. Anyone not in the bulletin that we need to be aware of? I talked to my dad a couple of times this week. He continues to recover from COVID. And for the first time in several weeks, he told me, he said, stuff is starting to taste better again. So he's finally pushing through, I think, on the other side of that. Anything else? Anybody else? Any updates? Everybody's quiet this morning. All right, if we don't have anything else, Mr. Gary, would you get us started with a prayer this morning?
Hey, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning, thanking you for this day that you've made for us, thanking you for the love that you've shown us, especially by providing your Son, Jesus Christ, to this earth, give us a pathway to salvation. Lord, we ask that you be with those who have been mentioned here today, be with Terry and Susan, and be with everyone else that is either sick or injured or traveling that would normally be in our midst. It's not. If be thy will that you bring them back to the next appointed time. Lord, every one of us need you, whether or not we're sick or not, we still need you every day, every way. So we just thank you for your love. We thank you for this day. We thank you for letting us come together as family, God. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, so we began last week going through Exodus as we wrapped up our previous study, and now we started going into Exodus, and we got into things last week. We looked into the first chapter of Exodus, and we looked a little bit at the situation and how things were set up, and we looked at how, as we go through, we'll look at 3 or 4 sections. One would be the deliverance, part 1, from chapter 1 through about chapter 6. Then there would be deliverance, part 2, which will run through the later part of chapter 6 through chapter 12. And then later in chapter 12, we will get into the Exodus. That'll go through chapter 18. And then in chapter 19 and through chapter 40, we will get to the covenant between God and Israel. And then last week we kicked into deliverance part 1, and we looked in chapter 1 at Israel enslaved and some of the historical background there. We talked about how we see the Jews arrive and live as free men in Egypt, which the part of Egypt they went to was a very, very, fertile part. It was abundant in food, it was abundant in water, it was abundant in grazing land for their animals. It was a great place to settle down. And then they're blessed by God. Not only do they grow in numbers and wealth, but they also rival the Egyptians around them. Their population quickly explodes, and they lived in all parts of Egypt. When they went to Egypt, how many were there? We said last week? 70 people. 70 people, and they eventually grow to rival the Egyptians in population. And then, of course, it was told in Genesis 26:4, it said, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give you offspring, all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. So then we get there, and of course, this is all done. Joseph is very successful, does very well liked at that time in Egypt. But then it tells us to a leader who does not know Joseph and says, does not know Joseph. It doesn't mean he'd never heard of him or that he was not aware of this part of Egyptian history. It means he just didn't recognize or honor the Jews out of respect for what Joseph had done. Now, Joseph guided them through a very tough time. They survived an epic famine. So, Joseph was highly esteemed in Egypt. But now we get to a new leader who doesn't really think that's, the sentiment among the Egyptians by this point had come to be, well, that was then, and this is now. Or as we get to today, we would probably say, okay, that's all good, but what have you done for me lately? All right, Joseph, that's past, that's history, that was fine, we appreciate all you did now. But what are you guys, what are you Jews doing for us now? Pharaoh tries to solve what he deems as an Israelite problem. And we talked about what the catch-22 he was in last week. As we got late in class last week, we talked about the catch-22 situation. These people, they were afraid of what? They were afraid they were going to join one of Egypt's enemies and fight them and leave. But Pharaoh also recognized that he couldn't afford for the Jews to just up and leave. Why? Because they were doing a lot of stuff. So he's scared of them, really doesn't want them around, but recognizes the fact they can't, right now they're in a position they can't make it without them. So he's trying to use some tactics that would weaken and limit their growth. So one of the things he does is he oppresses them by constricting them to serve in a kind of slave army of workers and charged with building projects. So they go to building things all over Egypt. Well, you guys work for us. We'll keep you profitable for us, but you'll do all the building for us. Well, this was hard work, which took them away from their farms, herds, and their families. So he's trying to tamp down the population by keeping them too busy to keep growing. So he takes them away from all their families. It didn't work, though, because it tells us they continued to what? They continued to grow. The population got bigger and bigger and bigger. They continued to grow. So then Pharaoh doubles down by going to the root of the problem, and he instructed what? The Hebrew midwives were to do what? Heard somebody. Kill the boys. The midwives are there, and he tells them, if it's a boy, to do what? Kill it. If it's a girl, hey, it's okay. Trying to limit that part of the population. But it doesn't work, does it? Because the midwives refuse to do it. They don't carry it out, and they claim that the Jewish women were hardy women. They claim that the Jewish women were able to have babies and be gone before, they were able to get there and interfere with the birth. Boy, those women, Pharaoh, they're just incredible women. They have those babies. We don't get a chance to get there before they have the babies and everything's situated. So, at one point you have to figure Pharaoh's sitting there going, He couldn't prove that they weren't telling him the truth, but you have to wonder if Pharaoh's sitting there going, really? Okay, we got to figure something else out. So Pharaoh now turns to trying to figure out another way. He then authorizes any Egyptian to kill any Jewish newborn male by drowning the baby in the river. But again, sparing the newborn females. Now, what does this parallel? What do we look, if we come forward to the New Testament time, what does this parallel? Herod, and the edict issued by Herod. So we see a parallel already here between the birth of Moses and the birth of Jesus. So Pharaoh says, kill him, dump him in the river. So now let's go to chapter 2 as we start looking at the deliverer, Moses. And specifically, let's look, as we start off here, let's go to chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Chapter 2, beginning at verse 1, and we'll go through verse 14. It says, a man from the household of Levi married a woman who was a descendant of Levi. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a healthy child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she was no longer able to hide him, she took a papyrus basket for him and sealed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and set it among the reeds along the edge of the Nile. His sister stationed herself at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself by the Nile while her attendants were walking alongside the river, and she saw the basket among the reeds. She sent one of her attendants, took it, opened it, and saw the child, a boy, crying. And she felt compassion for him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get a nursing woman for you from the Hebrews so that she may nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, yes, do so. So the young girl went and got the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, because I drew him from the water. In those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and observed their hard labor, and he saw an Egyptian man attacking a Hebrew man, one of his own people. He looked this way and that and saw that no one was there, and then he attacked the Egyptian and concealed the body in the sand. When he went out the next day, there were 2 Hebrew men fighting, so he said to the one who was in the wrong, why are you attacking your fellow Hebrew? The man replied, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, surely what I did has become known. So we see the start and we see the early part of Moses' life, and then we go fast forward real quickly here. But we look at this, we look at the providence of God. You know, Pharaoh here has ordered that all males are to be drowned in the Nile. Wouldn't you have liked to have been there at the conversation point when Pharaoh's daughter has that child, and Pharaoh goes, dear, where'd that come from? What do you think that conversation was like? Pharaoh's ordered all the male Hebrew children to be drowned. Does she tell him? You know, did she hide it from him that he was one of the Hebrew children? She knows it, but we don't know that Pharaoh ever knew it. So at first the Egyptians oppressed Israel, and the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and prospered. God continued to prosper them through his providence. Pharaoh tried to kill the babies, but more babies were born. Even the midwives who couldn't themselves conceive were unable to have babies. God's providence continues. Pharaoh required that all Hebrew male babies be thrown into the river. Well, the child who was to become the deliverer of the Jewish people was rescued from the river by Pharaoh's own daughter and raised in the court of Pharaoh. That's pretty noteworthy, isn't it? Pretty much shows how God can work through anything in God's providence, because he not only rescues this child, he does it through the family of the man who is ordering the children to be killed. That's impressive. All right, that's an artist rendering of Moses as we're looking at Moses here. How many of you, here, just let's pause a minute. How many of you, when the thought of Moses comes into your mind, you automatically think Charlton Heston? It happens, doesn't it? Because of the 10 Commandments, when you think Moses, you think, oh, Moses looked like Charlton Heston. Yeah, and Pharaoh looked like Yul Brynner. Just one of those things, just you can't get Charlton Heston out of mind when you think of Moses. So Moses lived about 120 years. He lived 120 years, and we can effectively sort of divide his life up into three 40-year sections. One is royalty in the court of Pharaoh in Egypt. One is a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian, and then a 40-year section as the leader of the Israelites. So the name Moses is given to him by the Egyptian princes who found him, and it does mean drawn out of the water. So Moses' awareness of his heritage. Indications are that Moses was aware, aren't there? And you have to figure that as his actual mother was raising him and bringing him up to that age before he went into the house of Pharaoh, that she took every opportunity to at least bring along and culturally inform him about his true background. And plus there are indications we see in the story where Moses kills the Egyptian, that there are indications that he was aware of his heritage. We're not told much about Moses' life growing up in Egypt, are we? We get the story here that he's found by Pharaoh's daughter. She rescues him. She turns him over to his actual mother to raise him until he's old enough to come into the house of Pharaoh. And then we're told what? Nothing. The next thing, as we're reading through there in Exodus, the next thing, suddenly Moses is out there watching the two, he's about to commit murder. So we're not told a whole lot about Moses' life growing up in Egypt. The Bible sort of quickly passes over the details of his life as the adopted son of the princess and moves directly to the second phase of his life as a shepherd in Midian. So we just fast forward. We're skipping over that part with the remote control. Ever start watching a movie and you know what's coming up in a section, you're like, I don't care about that part, so I hit the fast forward button and go to the part of the movie I like. We just go on past this. Acts 7:22 does tell us something, though, about Moses. Acts 7:22 says, so Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in his speech and actions. This tells us that Moses got the best education that he could get at that time. This was the civilization of that time. As adopted son or grandson of the leader, he would have gotten the absolute best he could get. Now, as I looked at this verse in Acts 7:22 this week, it hit me. This says he was powerful in his speech and actions. What does Moses say to God? I'm slow of speech. But he would not only have gotten all the educational aspect, he would have gotten the political aspects of that civilization. And Acts tells us he was powerful in speech, so Moses was being like a lot of us today. Well, I can't, God, because. When Acts tells us that Moses actually probably could. But Moses says, no, I can't do that. I need help. As a member of the royal house, Moses would have enjoyed the highest levels of luxury, influence, and prestige. Josephus records that legends of Moses leading successful military campaigns against the Ethiopians and becoming a highly capable leader. Well, think about that. But Josephus writes that Moses became a noteworthy leader of the Egyptian army. Moses would have experienced a lifestyle far removed from the average Egyptian, let alone the Hebrew slaves. We would have said that Moses had what kind of life in the house of Pharaoh? The term we use is cushy. He would have had a pretty good life in the house of Pharaoh, wouldn't he? Moses would have lived in a sprawling mud brick palace coated in white plaster, decorated with vibrant frescoes of flora, fauna, and battle scenes. The courtyards featured shaded gardens and artificial pools. That'd be, sign me up. This is a rendering of what a palace of Pharaoh would have looked like. A rendering there of how big the palace would have been. And then today, an archaeological dig at a site. Don't know that that was Pharaoh's, but of an Egyptian ruler's palace. As prince, he would have had access to fine linens, perfumes, and a diet rich in meats, fresh fruit, honey, and imported wines. So when we look at what Moses does and when he goes to lead the children of Israel out, you frame that in the background, this is what he put aside. Sometimes when we're asked to put aside things and we're just putting aside a little, you look here at what Moses put aside, and it was a lot. Moses could have lived out a life of comfort, couldn't he? Moses could have been a leader in Egypt. Moses would have learned to read and write both hieratic, the administrative script, and hieroglyphs. He would have studied mathematics, astronomy, surveying, and law. Moses would have been very well educated, very well trained. He would have learned multiple languages and scripts using the region, such as Akkadian and Canaanite dialects, to communicate with foreign delegates and vassals. You know, Pharaoh would have been prepping him to be a very important Egyptian person. Moses would have undergone intense physical training, including horsemanship, archery, chariot driving, and hand-to-hand combat. And again, we don't see any of this. This is all secular history. We don't see all of this, and we're not told about any of this because we go from he was a baby in the basket to he's out killing an Egyptian supervisor. Now, there would have been psychological and spiritual tension because Moses would have been expected to participate in the rituals of the Egyptian gods like Amun and Ra and show reverence to Pharaoh as a living god. But yet he had a mother that brought him up while she was raising him and would have told him about his heritage. Amun was the god that they believe created the world, the gods, humanity. And then you had Ra, known as the creator of the universe and the protector of the pharaohs, considered the father of the king, providing divine authority. Just one point to note, Ra had a head of a falcon. But Moses would have been trained in that as well. But yet his mother would have been bringing along in the heritage of the Jewish people. Now, because his mother Jochebed nursed him early in his early years, Moses would have known of his Hebrew heritage, creating an internal conflict. As a young child, he's raised with his Hebrew heritage. Then he's handed over to the house of Pharaoh, and he is raised completely as an Egyptian. So, we see Moses' first attempt at leading his people, helping his people, and what happens? As we get the quick narrative about his childhood, we see him there in verses 11 through 14, and he's out there, and he observes the Egyptian man attacking a Hebrew man, and Moses gets out there, he looks this way, that way, doesn't see anything. He takes the Egyptian man out, he kills him, and he does what? He hides the body. He doesn't just say, hey, well, he was mean to him, and I was trying to save him, and I was trying to protect him, so I took him out. Moses kills him, and then he says, uh-oh. So he hides the body. Now, as you look at the rest of that story in those verses, the one thing that hits me always when I look at that is, okay, he helps the Hebrew man out, and the next day when he's trying to separate a fight between two Hebrews, what's the one Hebrew say to him? Doesn't say, hey, we appreciate you helping us out yesterday with the Egyptian. The guy says, what you going to do? You going to kill me now too? No, thank you. No, we appreciate, well, that guy was going to really hurt me and you took him out. So now the Hebrews are going, are you going to kill me too? At this point, Moses realizes what? Yeah, the jig. Stacy says the jig's up. He realizes this is not going to be a secret for long. Now, what's going to happen when Pharaoh finds out that Moses killed an Egyptian? Not going to go well for Moses. So now Moses has to hit it out. His own people here reject and mock him. Possible. But there was still no indication that anybody appreciated him protecting the guy from the day before. And even then, his own people reject and mock him. What happens with Jesus? What did his own people do? Reject and mock. Again, we're seeing the precursor. He's afraid for his life because of the killing of an Egyptian, and Moses does what? Hits the road. He gets out of Dodge, as we would say. The victim was not just an ordinary citizen, he was an Egyptian overseer. This just wasn't Joe Blow of an Egyptian walking down the street. He was an overseer. Assaulting or killing a state official was treated as an act of rebellion against Pharaoh himself. Moses was in hot water. He was in hot water. Under ancient Egyptian law, Moses' punishment for killing the Egyptian taskmaster would have been some form of execution. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Joseph adds that Pharaoh was already looking for an excuse to execute Moses, as the royal court had become suspicious of his loyalties to the Hebrew people. So again, the Bible does not tell us a lot about this, but secular historian Josephus writes down, they're looking at Moses and his relationship with the Hebrew people going, this could be a problem. And you can see, as we looked at, if they're worried about the Hebrews joining up with an enemy and overthrowing them or leaving or whatever on them, they could see Moses now becoming a leader of the Hebrew people and thinking, he's going to cause us even bigger problems. So at this point, Pharaoh's going, we got to get rid of him. How do we do it? Pharaoh's also got to look within his own house and say, what's my daughter going to say if I kill him? All right, let's go to verse 15 here as we see where Moses gets on the run. Verse 15. When Pharaoh heard about this event, he sought to kill Moses. So Moses fled from Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he settled by a certain well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and began to draw water and fill the troughs in order to water their father's flock. When some shepherds came and drove them away, Moses came up and defended them and then watered their flock. So when they came home to their father Reuel, he asked, why have you come home so early today? They said, an Egyptian man rescued us from the shepherds, and he actually drew water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughters, so where is he? Why in the world did you leave the man? Call him so that he may eat a meal with us. Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. When she bore a son, Moses named him Gershom, for he said, I have become a resident foreigner in a foreign land. So Moses has now left Egypt. He's gone to Midian. The next period in his life is briefly summarized in a few verses here as he escapes to the land of Midian. Moses, at the point, was up in this area of Egypt. This is that fertile area in Egypt. So Moses, when he gets out of Egypt, doesn't just go a little ways, does he? He comes all the way over here. And if you look at the mileage scale on here, there's about 100, there's about 200. It'd be like going from Paducah to Hazard. If you got in trouble in Paducah, you go to Hazard, try to get out of it. So he doesn't just go 15, 20 miles down the road. Moses goes a long way away. Of course, Egypt was a very big place and a big people to deal with at that time. So he ends up over here in the land of Midian. The land of Midian was located in the northwestern part of the Arabian Peninsula, across the Gulf of Aqaba, and potentially parts of the southern Sinai. Excuse me. It was a dramatic contrast, though, to the fertile Nile Valley. He left this fertile area, this lush area of Egypt, and now he goes to a place that is arid, rocky, mountainous, featuring deep, dry riverbeds, and not a lot of plant life. This is not an easy place to live. Midianite society was largely pastoral and nomadic, relying on the herding of sheep, goats, and camels, along with involvement in desert trade routes. Think about this. All that he had when he was in the household of Pharaoh, all the food and the living and the style of life that he had, and now he's out in a place that's not nearly as forgiving to live in. He meets the daughters of his future father-in-law, Reuel, after saving them from aggressive local shepherds. He eventually marries into the family, has children, and settles into the quiet life of a shepherd. From a prince to a shepherd. It's Moses' life. If you look at verses 23 through 25, it says, "Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage. And they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them." So Moses had been in Egypt. He goes to Midian, and after the leader of Egypt from that time dies, the bondage becomes worse. The slavery becomes worse. The people are crying out to God, and God finally says, "It's time." The time that they had been there, they had gone into bondage, and they'd gone into slavery, and now at this point, God says, "It's time." God says that a lot, doesn't he? And sometimes it's not on a timetable we want, but at some point when God's ready to move on something, God just says, "It's time." That's like the second coming. At some point, the Father is going to turn to the Son and say, what? It's time. Here, as it pertains to the Israelite people and their bondage and slavery, God says it's time to do something. The time has come for God to deliver his people and sets the scene for the calling of the deliverer. And that's where we start seeing things happen in chapter 3 with Moses as the deliverer of Israel. All right, let's go into chapter 3 and look at the first 9 verses here. "So now Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from within a bush. He looked, and the bush was ablaze with fire, but it was not being consumed. So Moses thought, I will turn aside to see this amazing sight. Why does the bush not burn up? When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from within the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. God said, Do not approach any closer. Take off your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. He added, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a land that is both good and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now indeed the cry of the Israelites has come to me, and I have also seen how severely the Egyptians oppress them. So now he's ready. God says it is time. Moses is out pasturing his flock. He's out being a shepherd. He's out doing his thing, all he's supposed to do, and all of a sudden Moses sees what? A burning bush. And guess what? The bush is looks like it's on fire, but what's not happening to it? Not being consumed. All right, at that point, I'm already ready to turn and go the other way. After I've seen that it ain't burning up, it's like, whoops, something not right here. Something just not right. And not only that, what would you have done when you heard a voice from a bush that's burning, but yet not burning up? Huh? Run? Yeah. Or think, I don't need to eat or drink that anymore. But he hears a voice from a bush that's looks like it's on fire, but it's not being chewed up. And it says, angel of the Lord. What do you think of here when you think angel of the Lord? The term angel means what? Messenger. So it's a messenger. Theological experts and church fathers overwhelmingly identify the angel of the Lord here as a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. Most theologians will say this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. John Calvin, Matthew Henry pointed to the distinct roles within the Trinity when looking at this passage. And verse John 1:18 says the New Testament states that no one has ever seen God. And since Moses is looking into the bush here at this point, 1 Timothy 6:16 says the Father, Moses couldn't approach the bush. And the Son, it says, is the image of the invisible God in Colossians 1:15. In his commentary on Exodus, John Calvin writes that the angel who appeared to Moses is the eternal Word of God, the Logos, who is mediator between God and humanity even before his birth in Bethlehem. But a burning bush, like I said, it would have sent me running the other way, not waiting to find out what was going to come out of it. I might have stood there and watched the bush burn for a minute, but the first time I heard my name called out of the bush, nope, time to go. And he doesn't just say Moses' name once, does he? He goes, Moses, Moses. You can imagine Moses hears the first, Moses, what? Moses, oh, now I've heard it for sure. The burning bush is the first miracle recorded in the book of Exodus. We're going to see a whole bunch coming down through, but this is the first miraculous thing we see in the book of Exodus. And God calls Moses, as we said, not once, but he says his name twice. He says, Moses, Moses. You wonder if God got a little more vocal on the second one, hey, Moses. Moses. How many of you say your kid's name? Hey, Sue, and they don't sort of really get it. They sort of half hear it, and you go, Sue. How many of you have ever done that with your kids? Say it once, and it sort of goes by a little bit, and you say it a second time. God calls Moses twice. Moses answers, though, immediately. Doesn't he? He immediately responds. I'd have been going, somebody say something? But Moses immediately responds without hesitation. The Lord confirms that his appearance is real and that Moses is standing before the true and living God by commanding him to take off his sandals because he is where? Because the presence of God is there. He is standing on holy ground. And so he says, hey, this is real. Take your shoes off. This confirms that this is not a dream or a hallucination. Because you can think about it. Put yourself in Moses' shoes a minute. You're out there doing this. Maybe you think you've had an extra hard day. You didn't drink enough water. Maybe you ate something that disagreed with you. And at first, Moses may think, well, this is just, no, I'm having a dream, or I ate something wrong. And so this confirms this is not a dream or hallucination. It demonstrates the physical space he occupied was now holy and sacred because God also occupied it. And the removal of the sandals was his way of expressing his faith in the reality of the event. Think about that. If you're Moses and you don't believe this is real, you think this is a dream or you think this is an hallucination, are you actually going to take your shoes off? But Moses, by believing that this is actually happening, does take his shoes off. And then God identifies himself. God says what? I am. I am. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses then acknowledges that he is in the presence of God, but he does what? Hides his face. Moses now realizes he's in the presence of the one and only God, and Moses is like, no, I am not worthy. He hides his face from God. The typical human reaction to being in the presence, and we see this in Scripture, the typical reaction of being in the presence of angels or the divine being is fear as well as recognition of our own unworthiness and sinfulness. Think about this. If Jesus were to walk into this room and walk up to us as an individual, what would we do? Most of us would drop our heads. Most of us would struggle to look him in the eyes because we understand how unworthy, how unholy, how imperfect we are. And Moses here knows and understands the situation with him that he can't look at God in the face. Yeah. As Stacy's pointing out, after Peter meets Jesus and he comes out of the boat and he says, I'm a sinful man, depart. Most of us would not want to be in the presence because we would recognize our unworthiness. From Adam to Moses to Isaiah to Peter, men are completely overwhelmed and awestruck when in the presence of God, many afraid that they won't survive the experience. Looking ahead a little bit down the road, and we talked a little bit about this in our last class, what did the Israelites tell Moses to do? You go talk to God. We'll stay down here. You go risk being in the presence of God. We'll just stay down here and let you do that. Because they believed that if you went into the presence of God, you didn't survive. And then the purpose of the call, we got a minute or two, we may have to come back and recap this again. But the purpose of the call, God reveals to Moses why he has appeared to him before he actually calls Moses into service. He doesn't say right away, I want you to be the guy, does he? He says here in verses 7 through 9 that I have come down, I've seen the affliction, I've come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up into that land flowing with milk and honey. At this point, he tells Moses his plan. He just doesn't tell Moses yet what? Oh, by the way, you gonna help. Moses is probably sitting there at this point going, yeah, we're gonna get free. We're gonna get out of this Egyptian slavery, all of that. And in a minute, God's gonna drop the bomb on him and say, oh, by the way, through you is this gonna happen. Interesting note, he specifies exactly what land is going to be, what the promised land is going to be. He tells him what the whole list, the land that you're going to be going to is the land where these people are living. And he lists them by nationality. He says, that's the land we're going to. And we will stop there. We'll probably rehash a little bit of this and we'll stop there for today and get back continuing next Sunday.